This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, the topic will be new media of the 21st century. I'll be talking with a podcaster named Chris Stemp and a noted blogger named Dean Esme, and that will begin in a moment. Well, I'd like to begin this program with this basic premise. About a decade or so ago, there was a thing that came to rise known as the blogosphere, and it would be heard on newscasts, national newscasts, all over the place. And it was basically about people at home who started their own blogs and voiced their own opinions upon a whole matter of subjects. Probably the most vociferous and most well-known were political bloggers. And the blogosphere in the middle of last decade seemed to be something that came out of nowhere, uh, took over, and then after about 4 or 5 years, it sort of got marginalized, I believe, because of corporate interests. But yet, over the years, I've seen now in the last few years, a lot of the people who write into me send me links to listen to this podcast or that podcast and whatnot. And it seems that podcasts have replaced or displaced blogs as sort of the ma and pa media of this century. And it got me to thinking about why that was. Is it a technological thing? Was it a political thing? Or what the basis behind this was? On your screen, you will see Dean Esme, a noted blogger who a decade or so ago had probably one of the most, I guess, top 20 or 30 most well-read blogs, Dean's World, and Chris Stemp, a podcaster who has a podcast called Smart People, and that deals with a variety of subjects. So let me just let both men introduce themselves for a few minutes. I'll go with Dean since his medium started first. So Dean, if you want to take a few minutes, talk about who you are, what your blog Dean's World was, and what you're currently doing.
Well, let's see. I currently am a writer and an activist, focusing on men's issues primarily, not exclusively. I did run what was one of the most cited and influential blogs in the world 10 plus years ago. It is no longer that influential. I will say part of that was a good part of it was actually personal choice. I decided to shut it down because I didn't like what it was anymore. So that was a personal choice. But I was cited by the Library of Congress in the 2004 election. We got to attend a conference at the White House at least once. A teleconference, but we were invited. We got tickets to the Republican National Convention. Tried to get them to the Democratic National Convention that same year. They didn't want us. I got cited by some study in Oxford. Blah blah blah. That was all years ago. And I'm not entirely sure I agree that the blogosphere is been supplanted so much, because I think it's almost more like something like radio or television. The medium is still there, and it is still thriving for those of them who are good at it. And I can name a few notable bloggers who are still active and who are still basically the same bloggers they were 10, 15 years ago. But I would certainly agree that the field has changed, and that all the factors you've mentioned, plus one or two more you haven't, have changed it. So hopefully that's sufficient, at least to start.
Well, good, and you can voice your ideas in that regard as we go along. Let me turn to Chris Stemp. Just like Dean, if you could give a little background as to who you are, what your podcast deals with, and any views on the medium that you are engaged in.
Sure, yeah. I run a podcast called Smart People Podcast. I actually run it with a childhood best friend of mine, John Rojas, who couldn't make it on the show. And it's at smartpeoplepodcast.com. We started it about 5 years ago. So it's really interesting, almost exactly 5 years ago, actually. And it's really interesting because in that time, what's happened to podcasts is kind of mind blowing. And we've seen, the changes in terms of, so for example, we were put on New and Noteworthy right away, tons, a bunch of downloads. We got some incredible guests. I mean, Tony Hsieh, the CEO of Zappos, was one of our first guests. Brene Brown, and now what we're seeing is everyone who used to be a guest wants to have their own podcast. So I do think it might be going towards I don't want to say corporatization that we might be discussing, but I definitely think it's getting taken over by people who are bringing their their outside followers into their podcast. So I'm sure we'll get into that. And then I also have my own personal site, which is at chrisstemp.com. And really, that's just more um, what, I want to get into writing and blogging, but more on a personal, just share my opinions and whatnot.
Yeah,
The podcast is our main thing, and it's a hobby of mine.
yeah, I know that about a decade or so ago, I've known people who've done small press publishing for books and whatnot. And a decade or so ago, most of them would send it around to, literary bloggers. Nowadays, it's virtually the people who have ebooks to push, basically all going on podcasts. And I've known a few people, and I've seen, dozens of podcasts, some based in Britain, some based everywhere. And a lot of the podcasting too seems to be not sort of corporate. I mean, some of it is like the NPR kind of stuff or the
Mm-hmm.
BBC, but it still seems to, I don't know, just my naked eyeballing of it, maybe still a good, healthy third to a half is people from their own basements or whatnot still doing it. I don't know if that's
Yeah.
correct, but let me go and start with Dean, and let's talk about blogging, and then because I think blogging preceded podcasting by a few years. I know I had done an internet radio show called Omniverska back in '03, and the fellow who hosted the show had a website called Sursum Corda, and he had a big studio in his basement. This was 2 or 3 years before YouTube took off. We only did it for about a year, 12 shows. Uh, but am I right, Dean, that blogging, especially political blogging, probably took off in late '02, '03, and by the '04 election, it sort of seemed to come out of nowhere and take CBS, ABC, NBC, New York Times, the established media by surprise?
Yeah, I mean, I'd put it more like early 2002. I don't think we can. I mean, I'm remembering well enough. A whole lot of people talked to it right in the aftermath of 9/11 in late 2001, and a whole lot of people jumped in around then because a lot of people had strong feelings. But yeah, I'd say it started to grow and become something talked about as a potentially very strong, influential new medium. Yeah, around the end of 2002, 2003. By 2004, the major, presidential campaigns and political parties were like getting very interested in blogs. This is where daily codes became a thing. It was just a blog to start. I'm surprised people don't know that. Huffington Post too. They were over there on the left. You've got Instapundit and a few others on the right who just never stopped or who moved into new things. I think, the guys over at Hot Air started out as bloggers, and they're still running something that's mostly a right-wing blog, but it's sort of between a blog and a publication, a standard publication, isn't it? So yeah, your timeline's about right, and I would say the zenith of the blogosphere was probably, I don't know, maybe 2006, 2007. I think we started to see the decline after that. A decline, not a I think that's when we saw a decline.
What would you ascribe to said decline? It seemed to me, as someone who was reading, just skimming through most of the blogs, I'd read your blog, Joe Gandelman's blog, but I'd read the Andrew Sullivans here and there and other things that were linked from other blogs. It seemed to me that it was right after the '04 election is when media types seemed to say, oh, these guys are blogging from their basements. We need to have so and so. Let's forget a weekly column. If you can just do a little 200-word blog post, we can suck out some of their clout. Is that something that you think was a deliberate move into the blogosphere by corporate types?
Well, it certainly was, and I think the signal that that was going to be a thing was when Ariana Huffington actually sold the Huffington Post, which, by the way, caused some bad feelings that nobody remembers anymore. But that said, yeah, and now you can see the Washington Post's got bloggers, Los Angeles Times got bloggers. In fact, it's gotten so much to the point, and this may be off topic, but actually I'm starting to find a lot of news writers is just bloggers now and
Mm.
who've managed to get perches at places like Washington Post. And I think a lot of the reporting quality suffers because of that, to be blunt. But yeah, definitely, big business saw this is business, and this is a cheap way to create content. And that's why I think it may have also started to deteriorate because the big players thought, well, the most important thing is there's a blogger who can draw an audience, and that's cheap and easy to do, and that is where I think the decline actually began.
Let me turn
Because
to.
the early
Oh, go ahead.
bloggers were all doing it. Go ahead. Well,
No.
I'll just finish. The early bloggers were all doing it out of passion.
Yeah.
And that was the key difference.
Chris, I had mentioned an internet radio show that I had done in '03, and I think YouTube came along sometime in mid '05. Did that sort of coincide with the rise of podcasting? What effect did YouTube have on podcasting in terms of catalyzing people in that medium to say, "Oh, I can." All right, we lost Dean Esme. Hopefully, I'll get him back in a few minutes. His system seemed to have crashed. So let me carry on for a few minutes with just Chris Stemp. I had mentioned before Dean dropped out that YouTube became big around '05. Was that around the time that you first became aware of podcasting yourself? And when did you get into the medium?
Yeah, I became aware of it through the guy that I do the show with, John, and he's a big techie. I think what's interesting and what helps is if you surround yourself with people that have just different expertise, different knowledge, different interests. And so we played softball together. That was right around when we graduated college. And so he wanted to start a podcast about our softball team because podcasting was still really new and it was just going to be fun to send out to 20 friends and family. And so I think we messed around with it, but never took that anywhere. So that's when I kind of realized what podcasting was. But it wasn't until, like I said, I believe it was 2010 that we kind of picked it back up and said, let's do a real podcast, real as in something that other people might want to hear outside of our softball career. So that was kind of, although I heard about it in '05, I didn't really pay attention until about 2010.
Well, let's just talk a little bit about your podcast. You were telling me while we were in a break that you've got over 200 shows, and looking through it, I mean, it's called Smart People. Do you focus mostly on individuals, or do you have multiple individuals that you interview? And you seem to have across the spectrum, politics, media, science, softer, fuzzier kind of subjects. What is the main focus of your podcast?
Yeah, the main focus, honestly, is, and this is how it started, and I think this kind of spells out the focus. John and I started this in 2010. We both quit our jobs. We both worked in the corporate world. I worked in finance. He was a consultant for Deloitte, and we kind of got burnt out. We were working a lot of hours, making a lot of money, but neither of us were really happy in what had happened. And like I said, I've known him since I was about 10. We were college roommates. So him, myself, and then at the time my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and a friend of mine all said, let's go make a story out of this year, kind of. And so we moved to Arizona. We took a road trip across the country. We moved to this house in the mountains, burned through a lot of the money that I had earned in finance. And I promise this is getting to your story, or to the point of your question. And we said, we both wanted to learn about the world, about what's out there, and about possible opportunities for jobs that we might enjoy. Well, what's the easiest way to do that? It's to talk to other people who have been successful in their careers or in their industry. And so it really happened. We said, how do we convince people who wouldn't normally talk to us to give us 30 to 45 minutes of their time? And podcasting seemed like a good medium. It was easy, it was cheap, and it was getting a little bit more well known. And so the focus of the show is really, let's have a easy, general conversation, not so much an interview, but a conversation with the smartest people we can talk to, so that we can both learn about their life and how they got to some sort of pinnacle. We really most of them we feel like have gotten to some kind of pinnacle. and then learn about their subject to see if it interested us. So that's the only requirement, is somebody that I would want to talk to.
So, with the people, then are you? Is it more or less that you're looking for secrets of success, or is it more so a more humanistic approach of what makes these people happy or gets them fulfilled, or is it a combination of both?
That's a great question. It's much more leaning to the secondary point you made. What makes them happy? Where's the fulfillment? I'm a generally extremely curious person, and I do most of the interviews. I'd say I've probably done the last 70 by myself, and even prior to, did the majority of the questioning, just because, again, our strengths. Mine is talking, I guess, and listening, and John deals with the production and a lot of that. But, we really try to figure out what makes these successful people, like, what's behind them, because so much of society today is, let's talk about the millionaire billionaire, and that defines the success. And what we've found is that the majority of these people, that's kind of secondary. And I actually ask all of our guests, and we're putting it in an ebook, with the question, what does success mean to you? And of course, you can imagine, no one has ever said money.
Okay, we have Dean Esme back, and before I go over to Dean, let me just give Chris a chance to finish up. Chris, we were just talking about your website, and you had defined a little bit about the aims. While we were waiting to get Dean back before we did that little segment, you had talked a little bit about the finances behind your podcast. And I want to use that as a segue to get back to Dean. I know with Cosmoetica, which is my website, which is a popular art site, I know you can't make shit in terms of money. The Google ad rates are ridiculously low, and people have asked me, for example, when I've done this show on YouTube, trying to get in there, it's a totally different medium. I consider it sort of like the difference from going from silent film to radio or television or something, and so I basically had to start from scratch. But you had mentioned that you were able to get some advertisers for your podcast. And I know that in blogging, at least with a lot of the bloggers like Dean, who are doing it from their basements, it's also been difficult for them to make any money. So tell me how you were able to sort of monetize your show.
Yeah, really what happened was 3.5 years in, we were approached by somebody who was selling ads, and this was really at the beginning of advertisers paying to be on podcasts. And he said, and we had never thought about making money ever on podcasting. That was not at all a point or a goal. And it didn't really happen back in 2013, I think, when we started making money. So we said, yeah, sure, go ahead, try and sell whatever you want. And he sold a few for a couple $100, and we were like, wow, it feels like free money. Well, what happened was the guy we were working with, who found us just because he liked the show, he got picked up. He went to work for what is now the largest advertising agency for podcasts. It's called the Midroll. And they represent huge shows, the biggest shows, and they have, it's easier if you can aggregate a bunch of great podcasts for a sponsor. It kind of makes sense that they're going to want to advertise. And so we work with the Midroll now, and they booked every show this year. We've had sponsors. So I'd say some of it was luck, but as is everything in life. But to keep the sponsors interested, I think really depends on the authenticity of the show, the strength of your connection to your listeners. And so although there are shows that are much larger than ours, the people that listen, we've built a pretty solid community that wants to hear a little bit about the sponsors we bring on. And so the rate of return that they've seen has been pretty good, and the sponsors have stuck around.
When you say the sponsors choose some of the shows, they don't choose who you interview, do they? Or
no, they literally just say, we're gonna book 4 spots once a month for 4 months, and then they'll pick a pre-roll, mid-roll, or post-roll. And this might be more information than you want, but people who are interested in podcasting, pre-roll is 15 to 30 seconds before the show. A mid-roll is about 60 to 90 seconds in the middle of the show, and a post-roll is about 10 to 30 seconds at the end. And the rates for podcasting advertisement is about for a mid-roll, about $30 per 1,000.
Uh-huh.
So, and you usually can't sell ads or sponsorships until you're at, I'd say at a minimum, 10,000 downloads per episode. So, at a minimum, you're making $300 per mid-roll if you can sell those spots.
That's interesting. Dean, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, we lost your audio, but your video, but we still have you on audio. So let me talk, because while you were gone, and just now Chris was finishing up telling us a little bit about his podcast and some of the business behind it. I had mentioned earlier about my idea that big money had sort of moved into blogging and sort of displaced some of the sort of mom and pop bloggers. What do you think? You had said that the height of blogging was about 06, 07.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. What other than moneyed influences coming in? What do you think also contributed to sort of, if not the decline, sort of the shine coming off the blogosphere, in that you weren't getting the Dan Rathers or the Peter Jennings or the Tom Brokers of the day mentioning, such and such blogger said this. Do you think that it had more to do with, say, the coming of things like the Instagrams and the Twitters and these other media as well?
I believe that social media like Twitter and Facebook definitely did a major number on blogs, although I think that is overall a good thing, because we saw in the early blogosphere just anybody could do it, which was the beautiful thing, but not everybody was that good at it. One of the other things that happens when you're a blogger, and I've gone through this experience several times of both being obscure and then somewhat being famous and then not being famous again, and I've gone through that cycle a few times. I forgot what I was going to say about that.
The fame and non-fame, the cycle.
Oh, yeah. Well, what happens is this: when you're doing it for passion, you develop a loyal fucking following, because your following doesn't even necessarily always agree with you, but they believe in you as a person. And in fact, I think one of the things that's going to come back, one way or the other, is a spirit that was in the early blogosphere that is mostly gone now. And what that is authenticity. You knew that if you were reading a blog, even a big one, the chances were that if you left a comment, the author was going to read that and think about it. And you could almost have a one-on-one relationship with him. Almost, right? But the bigger you get, and I'm sure Chris here will there's a good chance he'll agree. When you have 5 fans, you know them all. And when you have 5,000 fans, you almost feel like a jerk because you can't get to know them. And in fact, you have to sometimes push them away from you. And you feel like garbage because you feel like you're being Mr. Celebrity, when in fact, no, you're just a human being who's pushing back, who can't take the overload of people who want your attention and want your individual, want to have the individualized argument with you. But at the same time, I think I've seen this, I've less seen podcasts than the YouTubers, but it's the same thing. As it's a different, YouTube is a different mentality, it's a type of podcasting, and I am seeing it on blogs that survive as functioning blogs. I believe that when corporations came out, social media hurt blogs, or just winnowed the field anyway. Also, the early blogs were almost always intensely personal, and that had to go away, and blogs had to get more and more focused on a specific subject area to get anywhere. Corporations started getting into blogging, but actually I believe blogging, and as well as podcasting and YouTubing and a few others, are going to make a comeback in some fashion. The big benefit to a blog is still this, and it's something no podcast can easily offer, or no YouTuber can easily offer, which is I can search for what you said, where you said it, and what your proof was using the find key. My ability to do that on your podcast, however, is really limited and a lot of work. So print, at least for now, is going to have that benefit, and you're searching for a topic and you find some blog that covers that topic. It's hard to do that with podcasting and whatever. So, and I can give you some examples of successful bloggers that are still doing it. Robert Stacy McCain, a very conservative guy, he's running a profitable personal blog. Instapundit is still doing it. Professor Glenn Reynolds. Joe Gandelman's doing it with the Moderate Voice, and they're doing okay. I think they're actually going to do better in the coming years because the corporate bloggers, it's becoming increasingly corporate bloggers / journalists, because sometimes you can't tell the difference between a corporate blogger and a journalist anymore. That's like blurred. Especially if you look at something like, well, I won't pick on anybody's favorite publication, but there's an awful lot of people who are basically wealthy stay-at-homes or trust fund babies who are now writing for certain big-name publications simply because they can and they want to, and not because they have any real vested interest in what they're doing. So I truly believe that in the early 21st century, in the coming decade especially, the number one commodity on the internet is going to be authenticity. The belief, true or not, that you're fucking for real with whatever you're saying. And people are going to flock to that. And you're going to see that in blogs, YouTubes, and podcasts, because nobody trusts the corporate elements anymore. So I think that's what the future is. And we're on the cusp of that change right now.
Yeah, Dean, you made a good point, one that I was going to bring up. So I'll pick up on it. You said how you can basically Google words, the typed word basically on a blog, whereas in podcasting you cannot do that, at least not now. Maybe in another 5 or 10 years, if Chris or someone says, Obama sucks or Bush caused 9/11 or whatnot, they'll be able to go to 2243 into podcast 131 or something and do that the same way. But right now we don't have that, and I'm wondering if you think, Dean, that ability to Google exactly what you said was the way that the corporate bloggers and corporate entities that didn't like a certain blogger's opinion were able to target that blogger.
Absolutely. In fact, I have been so targeted. And by the way, Wikipedia is used as a weapon that way now too.
Yeah, tell me about it.
There are organized groups on Wikipedia who have editor accounts who there's substantial evidence that some of them are working reporters who do things like get their story off a blog, go put an entry about it into the news, then go put an entry into Wikipedia anonymously. So they have now established a narrative with multiple sources. Yeah. And really it was all just them or their friends, but they're using their perch at their corporate location to do that, which is why there is growing unrest at Wikipedia, by the way. And there's growing unrest in general with corporate media. Google recently majorly changed their search algorithms to actually sort of deprecate the importance of what really are big corporate blogs. Like pretty much every Gawker Media property is a massive corporate blog, and it's all link whoring, and people are really getting sick of that too. So I don't know. What was the question, or did I just...
No, I basically was asking you to confirm what my suspicion was. Let me turn to Chris. I know that one of the things that got the blogosphere a decade or so ago, got it sort of, I guess you would call the sort of memes that got floated out into the internet, was when bloggers used to go after each other. I know, and I'll get back to Dean in a minute. I know Dean had some what would call flame wars with some other bloggers. Is that rife in the hold on, Chris? Is that rife in the podcasting world? I know you probably don't because you're not primarily a political blog, but have a podcast. But have in the podcasting world, I know that there are people who have historical blogs, who have definitely political blogs. Do you find that in the podcasting world as well, where you have podcasters who sort of draw viewers or listeners due to their wars with other podcasters over politics or sex or religion or this or that?
No, I mean, I would say that the more divisive you can be, or the more confrontational, might attract people, but it's not going to be against another podcast often. It's just that people want to hear conflict. I often actually get listeners that write in and say, hey, you should, try to make it a little more confrontational on your show, your interview. And the thing is, that's just not my style, so I'm not going to do it. But in terms of using your platform as a podcast to argue with other podcasters, especially in the space I'm in, doesn't happen. And I don't think really hardly at all, except when you're getting exactly in the, just in the political sphere. And I think that's going to happen in any medium for the rest of time, just given how, divided we are in regards to how we feel about politics.
Dean, let me turn back to you. I mentioned that I believe that that was one of the things that helped the blogosphere sort of sustain itself for a few years. Do you think that the constant flaming back, usually between left and right, and sometimes between bloggers of individual, with their individual dislikes of each other, do you think that wore thin and that also contributed to, the bloom coming off the rose?
No, actually, I don't. I
No.
don't think it did. I think the balloon came off the rose for some because they just got tired of the constant hitting, and so some of us quit. I mean, I took a break for a couple of years, but because I couldn't take the constant wars. And sometimes wars would come to you when you're not looking for it. Because if you're talking about contentious issues, and they don't even have to be politics, could be religion, could be some contentious area of science that's under debate. You will get passion, and sometimes you get a lot of heat and very little light. On the other hand, sometimes conflict, when it's managed properly, actually will shed light. It'll generate heat and light, and it's become something productive. So I don't think that fighting, whether it's I mean, listen, one of my favorite podcasters alive today is a guy named Steve Dahl, who started as a radio guy in Detroit and Chicago. You may have heard of him in the 70s. He was responsible for something called Disco Demolition. He's off the air now. He's on the podcast, and I think he's in his 60s. And he's just never stopped doing what he does. But he would admit to you that early on in his career, he was told that if he was going to get anybody anywhere, he was going to have to beat certain other radio personalities of his era. And he will admit he in part built his career for several years running by regularly and sometimes quite viciously attacking a man named Wally Phillips, who was the #1 radio guy in Chicagoland at that time. Again, the 70s, early 80s. And there's where you get into the problem of what heat can do. We'll call it heat, right? It's arguing, it's conflict, it's friction. It can drive eyeballs. But then the question becomes that eventually you're going to have to search your soul and say, why did I create the heat? And was this heat I needed to create? Or was I just opportunistic? And at the same time, I mean, let's say if I was being a complete, tit here, I can decide I'm going to listen to Chris Stemple's podcast and I'm going to be a complete tit. And I'm going to start picking on Chris Stemple in every podcast I do just to see if I can pick up some of his listeners. Now, that would be a dick move and a rather nihilistic way of living, right? Because I ain't got anything against Chris. Right?
Yeah.
Somebody can do that, though, and people have done it to me, and it's like, somebody addresses an argument to me, because I got a lot of people follow me, and it's like, I got to look every time someone challenges me, are they really challenging me, or are they just being a dick? And that's an exhausting headspace to be in. But sometimes, contentious issues are contentious because there's people hurting, and you have to talk about the contentious things. So in the final analysis, I'm not convinced that fighting is what does things in. It's what's causing the fighting. What is the motivation for the fighting? And what is the outcome of the fighting?
Yeah.
And I don't think that was ever the main problem. I think the main problem is that corporate entities figured out that by being assholes all the time, like they do over at Gawker. And by the way, I don't have any personal stake with Gawker, which is why I use them as an example. They've never written about me. But they're professional dicks. And what they do is professional clickbait. Who the fuck wants that? And I guess the only thing I'll say about that is when it gets back to whether you're doing heat or not, whether you're rude or polite, I truly believe that long term, not short term, but long term, the audience is looking for authenticity. Are you for real? Are you really meaning what you say? And are you, like, if you get nailed on a big mistake, do you own it?
Yeah.
Your audience will love you if you do. And if you don't have that, if you're just a narcissist who's looking for attention, eventually people are going to stop looking at you, or they're just going to laugh at you, and you're going to become fucking what, Jerry Springer or something.
Yeah.
But I think the individual podcasters and the individual, they offer the same thing that a mom and pop store does. Like Chris, he's doing a podcast with his friend. They offer the same thing that a mom and pop store, like the mom and pop store I get my vapor equipment from. I walk in there, they know me by name, and there's a personal service there that I'm never going to get at a Starbucks. It's just not going to happen. And I think people crave that. And I think personal blogs are going to get more popular. The really good ones, they're going to get popular again. I think YouTubers and podcasters are going to slowly supplant the corporate media because big corporations, by their nature, can't create an authentic product for long before they start running into problems.
Well, let me end this segment, and in our next segment we'll talk a bit more about your shows, your best shows, and something. But let me segue into that by talking. Dean, you had mentioned the fan bases out there, and I wanted to talk. Let me start with Chris. Do you know who your basic fan base is? Do you like? I know for my website Cosmoetica, I could pay like $30 extra a month if I wanted to know. If intellectuals in Syria liked Cosmoetica, and occasionally I do find interesting little tidbits that they send for free. Like I know, for example, my art's website is popular in Nepal, so I guess Buddhists like it, but and also South Africa, interestingly. But who do you who makes up the most of your fan base, and what kind of feedback do you get? Is it mostly emails? Is it mostly positive?
Yeah, I mean, kind of to go off what Dean's saying with the authenticity, I think so. Our fan base, they all, I feel like I know almost all of them, even though that's impossible. But there's such a kinship because you listen to our show for really two reasons. You like the style, and the style is it's non-apologetic in terms of it is if you were to talk to me on the street or listen to my podcast, it's the exact same. There is no marketing, there is no BS. We don't get people on because they're going to bring eyeballs, and we've suffered, I think, monetarily because of that thus far. But if I'm really, I do this for the end of the day. Do I enjoy what I do, and do I think I'm putting good things into the world? And that just is what it is. So to get to your question on the audience, we can get the demographics through our hosting platform, which is Bluehost, and we can see where the majority of people live. We're downloaded in pretty much every country in the world. Obviously, of course, the majority is in the U.S., but you also have a good amount in Canada, a good amount in Australia. And what we actually found is a lot of people in non-English speaking countries listen to the show to help them with their English. And the reason is it's a very conversational show. It's how people talk in the real world. So they like that. And we've gotten a lot of emails talking about that, something we never expected. And then we do poll them because our sponsors want to know. And we tell them straight up, like, you're filling this out so that we can tell the sponsors who is listening. And again, if you tell people straight up, it's a free podcast. We've been doing it for 5 years. If you enjoy it and you spend a couple minutes helping us out here and there, you're totally fine with that. And so the thing I was saying about the kinship with the audience is they're also people who have a very similar life path, and it's noticeable in the things they fill out. So most of them are either fairly well educated, formally or informally. So maybe they did go to school, go to college, get a master's, PhD, whatever, or maybe they dropped out, but they read a lot. They're curious about the world, and most importantly, they realize that the more you know about a variety of subjects is going to benefit your life either professionally or personally. So, kind of a long way of answering, just saying that there are, if you care, you can connect with your audience, find out who they are, and then try to form a little bit of that bond. And lastly, I'll say also kind of what Dean mentioned earlier about, when we first started, and still to this day, I think the appeal is if you email us, I email you back. I talk about my personal experiences. I talk about some vulnerabilities. But I'd say about 6 months ago, it got to the point where we had to put up an email responder that said, "We'll get back to you, but it might not be for a while." And that's because honestly, like, the podcast can't support me financially full time. So I have another job. I have a young baby. So you get to the point where you just go, I need a little bit of time for me.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, Chris, because I know I could never make it on legitimate radio because I'm and people email me and they think that I'm smoking a stogie sitting around in my Bermuda shorts ordering hits on people because but it's like I'm just talking about the subjects I like to talk. Some of it's philosophy, some of it's science, some of it's this new media, some of it's the arts, and but to touch on what you said and what Dean had said earlier, let me just end this segment talking with Dean. I know you had mentioned the difference between 5,000 and 5,000 fans, and I know I get a shitload of submissions of art stuff. I get, I mean, I could probably review 5 new films a week if I wanted to take on stuff, and I have to. I get so many stuff from people that I send it to the what do you call the trash bin or whatnot, and so then Google starts getting these automatically sending it. I get submissions from India. I mean, India churns out more bad poets with PhDs than the rest of the world combined, and they all send to me. It's like the swallows coming back to Capistrano. Every 6 weeks, I get the same 500 people sending me, their stuff. But I know, Dean. Let me just ask you: to what degree do you think you were able to keep in touch with your fans at the height of your website or your blog? And what do you miss that to any degree?
All right, now maybe we'll use my story here as an abject warning for anybody going into it, which is one of the reasons I shut my blog down. Is I literally overloaded from all the attention and couldn't do it anymore, and I needed to really re-examine what am I doing, why am I doing it, what do I want the attention for exactly, blah blah blah. And that's why I more or less went on a hiatus for a couple of years. I had other things going on in my life too, but that was just like, I have to rethink this whole thing. And anybody getting into this business needs to think about that, because they could reach that point. Because I didn't know how to keep in touch with my fans anymore. In fact, I started to realize I had a significant fan base who I had real serious issues with, and I did not see things this way, and they wanted me to be somebody I wasn't. And so I went through that too, and that's why, even though it's very small pool, 5,000 fans doesn't sound like a lot, for example, or 10,000 or whatever, but no, it's still celebrity, and it will still fuck with your head if you don't keep it in perspective. I had lost touch with my readers. I had almost completely lost touch with my readers. I didn't know who they were anymore, and they didn't know who I was anymore. It's part of why I shut down. And I don't know what you do about that, except I will go back to the fact that I know one of the mistakes I made as a blogger is I started bringing in. I had about a dozen regulars who were also blogging for me. And now it's not a blog anymore, it's a publication. Yeah. And I didn't realize sufficiently just what managing a publication with multiple submitters meant. Which is why I am back to, at least for me, venues where basically I'm the only one in control, is the only ones where I operate. And a lot of people may find that's all they can do, which is another reason why, by the way, podcasting, YouTubing, and having your own blog are not a bad thing. But be careful if you think you're going to make a living at it. Not many people can.
Yeah. All right. Well,
making a living will cause you to prostitute yourself to some extent.
Yeah.
Because you wind up compromising. You just do as soon as cash gets into it.
Well, let's end on that note, and in the next segment get a little bit more upbeat, because I want to talk about what both of you think were some of your highlights, the best shows, the best uh, uh, blog posts that you wrote, and we'll do that in a moment. Well, I wanted to get a little bit more upbeat from sort of the more downbeat tone that we might have had in the last segment. And let me start with Dean, because I started reading you maybe a dozen or so years ago, and I don't know what the count was. You probably did several thousand blog posts over the years. If you look back in your inventory, and I don't know if they're all still online, I remember at one point Dean's World was down. I don't know if that was part of your taking a break. You brought it down, but what do you think was some of the best blog posts that you had done on Dean's World or elsewhere? And not only best, but what were the most popular posts? And did any of the popular ones really take you by surprise and go, oh, I had no idea. I was just farting that out, and now it's gotten 372 replies.
I'm in a little bit of a jam on my Dean's World blog, which it was really quite huge at one time, and now isn't. And then I also had a system crash where I lost a crap ton of old stuff that never got recovered. So there's stuff I remember writing and that was popular that's more or less gone now, which I try not to dwell on. But keep backups, guys. Keep multiple backups. I did, I think what got me into the Library of Congress was that I did one-on-one in-depth interview. It was with 4 of the Swift Vote Veterans for Truth who were critical of John Kerry. And the interesting thing about that is that none of the corporate media would do that, but I did. And I was the only one who published in-depth interviews with those guys. And that's actually what got me into the Library of Congress for that year. But beyond that, what's been happening with me now, I'm running a podcast called Black on White, Red Pill Radio, which is, I'm quite proud of it, because me and a friend of mine named Mumia Ali, who's in Philadelphia, we talk about race issues, and we do it in a way nobody talks about race issues, at least the way you see in the mainstream media. I get a lot of compliments on that. I do a show with a woman named Erin Pitsy on domestic violence and abuse issues, and I'm particularly proud of that because I hear regularly from men especially, because we are talking mostly about male victims on that show, male rape victims, male domestic violence victims, male child abuse survivors, and there's so little for them out there that when they find us, I've gotten so many nice notes, and so many people who are grateful that because nobody's doing that. But I mean, right now, otherwise, I don't really blog. I use social media, and I'm thinking about where I'm going to go next. But I've written for Huffington Post. I've written for a Thought Catalog. I've written for Voice for Men. Still write for the Modern Voice now and then. I don't know what I'd want to publish now, except I would hope people maybe go out on. We have it archived on YouTube and elsewhere. The archive of a show I do called Revelations with Erin Pitsy. We've talked to so many interesting people on that show, and it's been endlessly rewarding. Not financially, but spiritually, psychologically, and I hear from a lot of other people that it's helped them too, including maybe saved a few lives. So there's that.
I do remember some of your posts when you wrote. I think you had a pet that once died. This was maybe 10, 12 years ago. I remember you had done.
Oh, my dog Buttons died. Boy, people were really moved by that.
Yeah, I think
I remember writing it, and I could barely see what I was typing because the tears in my eyes were so blurry, and I just hit publish and walked away, and people fell in love with that. So.
And I do remember a few other posts on your children that also I don't remember what the topic, maybe the first time they went to kindergarten or something, but I do remember that because those were interspersed with some of your more political stuff. Let me turn.
And what's interesting is, and let me just mention this too. This may be the big change people need to know about blogging now versus blogging then. I think the biggest transformation has been that in the early days, a lot of the most popular bloggers, and I was one of them, made no effort or very little effort to put a wall between their political opinions, their opinions on baking, their opinions on cooking, their opinions on poetry. They made no effort, and I didn't either. I would write about what I wanted, no matter what it was. I would write about fucking American Idol if I wanted to, and people would ask me why, and I'd say because I like the show, and that was my only reason. That sort of thing gives you authenticity, but at some point also your readers are like, well, I'm not interested in those things. And I do think in going into the future, whether it's podcasting or whatever, you are going to need a specialty that sits you out and that you mostly spend your time talking about and leave most of the other stuff aside.
Chris, let me turn to you. In your 200 plus podcasts, are there a handful of shows you're most proud of? What were and are they equivalent to the shows that got the most response? And was there, any person or field where you found you're most comfortable talking about certain things, or you found that resonated most with your fan base?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions there. Trying to think which order to answer them in. So I'll say one of the things we realized with the fan base is they tend to love the more personal things that deal with being human. So when we talk about the brain or psychology or philosophy, people really tend to like that because I think everyone, it's the one thing we all have in common, right? And so those subjects tend to really agree with folks. Business is always popular, even though it's one that's overdone, and I don't really like that often. I like talking to authentic entrepreneurs. So, we interviewed a guy named Khalis Taid, who he's one of the most, I don't know, he makes the most money blogging or something. That's not the point. The point is millions and millions of dollars, and it's a cool story to listen to. So those are fun. I'd say what I realized, and my favorites often tend to be journalists who are going on an adventure, and I didn't see that happening necessarily. But so I believe it was episode, I think I have it somewhere. Let's see, it was episode 150. We interviewed a guy named James Nestor. He's a journalist, and he wanted to write a story about free diving, which is where no oxygen, you just dive straight down. And being a journalist, your job is to tell a good story, whether it be written or verbally on a podcast. It kind of takes you through that. In a 45-minute show, you can essentially get an idea of what his book was, and it was great. So those are good. I'd say the ones I'm most proud of are the fact that I've created a medium that allows me to talk to some of my heroes or some people that I very truly admire, such as Brene Brown. She's given one of the most popular TED Talks of all time. We interviewed her fairly early on. I want to say it was episode 45. And she really has been life-changing, not just for me, but for a lot of people. And so realizing, hey, I created something that is going to allow me to talk to people like her. Or Simon Sinek, who he has this movement. It's called Start With Why. It's really about finding why people do what they do and why you would want to do what you do. So there's a lot of things that go into my favorites, and I'm very often surprised. But I will say, out of 210 episodes, I have left the conversation, energized, enthused, and really just more curious on all but two.
Mhm.
And oftentimes I don't know much about the people going into it. They might reach out to me and I say, sounds like an interesting subject, or I might, come across an article and say, I think I'm going to like their opinion. And really, if you give smart people, and smart can take on a number of ways, but an open place for them to talk about what they're passionate about, I find that you very rarely end up with anything other than just a great time.
Yeah, that's a good point, Chris. I know when I try to do interviews, when I did written interviews before the predecessor to this video series, I try not to over research something. If I know a lot about it, then I go in with what I have. If there's a specific date or something, yeah, I'll look that up. But I think it helps give what Dean had mentioned a more genuine feel to the conversation rather than just, standing there and trying to be sort of William F. Buckley and be a sciolist that knows everything. Well, we're talking about post-Soviet Romanian politics, and now we're talking about Malaysian butterflies, and pretending that you know as much as the experts do on that. Um,
Right.
let me just ask both of you then. I know a couple of months ago I did a show on alternate cosmologies, and I had four people who had alternatives to the Big Bang theory of the origin of the cosmos. And I know I had wanted to get some Big Bangers on there, and also people who believe in a multiverse, multiple universes, as those are the two most dominant theories in academia and in the sciences. And I got totally shut out. I tried several dozen people, and so I got these four fellows who are on the fringe, but they have some interesting ideas. And we did a 3-hour debate. I did a 3-hour debate with the four of them, and it was a very interesting show. And I sent the show to all the people. Not a single, all of the Big Bang people, not a single one of them got back to me on it. I'm wondering, both of you, and I'll start with Dean and then go to Chris. Was there ever any blog or a podcast, Dean, that you've done that uh, you just got totally, shunned by the establishment people, and what was it? Dean, are you still there?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh,
I am here. You're catching me there because uh, 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 has that ever happened to me? I mean, yes. I mean, there are. It's happened to me enough that I'm struggling to remember. I mean, there are cases where I try and get somebody and I realize there's just no point. They're not going to talk to me. I'll try, and I know they're not going to. So actually, I'm going to find. I'm going to have to think about that.
okay. How about you, Chris? Has there ever been a show where, you were looking to get, person A, B, or C on to talk maybe one-on-one with some opponent or something, that you were surprised at the resistance maybe that you might have gotten?
I'll say that yes, there are plenty of people that don't get back to me, and it's one of the things. I'll tell anybody that if you really want to test your character, build something, build a podcast, build a blog, build a YouTube, because it will bring up things that you don't even know you have. So when I ask somebody to be on the show and they respond, sorry, no, I'm okay with that because they responded. When people don't respond, now I understand. I totally do. But for years, it really hung with me for a while. Because I'm like, how can you be so busy you can't even respond to me? I'm trying to put you in front of thousands and thousands of people. It's going to take 45 minutes. So, but in terms of individuals, there's still one person that I just don't get. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Sam Harris,
Oh yeah.
but I'm a huge fan of him, and I've emailed him and Facebooked him and all that stuff. No response. Then I was put in touch with his publicist, who's representing another author, and they wanted him to be this other person to be on the show. We said sure, and I said to the publicist, while I had him, hey, by the way, we'd love to have Sam on, and he literally just responded, alas, Sam is not interested. And I'm thinking, the main reason is because we're not big enough for him. Because he does press, right? He's on The Daily Show. He's on, plenty of places. Other podcasts. He's on Tim Ferriss' show. So he's essentially saying, your reach is not worthy of my time. And it's taken me a while to go, well, all right. Actually, that's fair. So it is what it is. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I've gotten a version of that. I've done two shows so far called Visionary or Fraud. The first one I wanted to do was on Noam Chomsky. I'm hopefully I'm going to get that by the end of the year. But I've done two. The first one was on Richard Dawkins because while I'm an agnostic and atheist, I think I think he's a fraud. I think he's made millions just selling this book, this idea of atheism, and banging his head against the wall with religious believers. And to me, that's phony. I got the interesting thing was I got so many people who were agnostics and atheists who supported his beliefs, but did not want to go on in support of him because they think he was a scumbag, basically, and they didn't want to be seen seeing him. And I guess there's something about he has had some sexual issues with some of his students or something like that. I'm not sure what it was, but I don't. But and then the other one was Ray Kurzweil, and I got a number of people that disliked Ray Kurzweil and were against him, but didn't want to come on and say that. And Chomsky has been the worst of all. It's taken me 6 7 months. I had one guy who sort of had a mental breakdown who was a supporter of Chomsky, but I've gotten so many other people, and I'm not going to name them because they are some people who. If you Google anti-Chomsky, you can find them writing for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or whatnot, but who don't want to go on any show where their voice is going to be identified with putting him down. And it's just interesting how that works, because I mean, if you've written in books, and some of these people have written in books against these people, and yet they don't want to actually come on and stand behind their voice, and it's something I find very puzzling. I'm sure Dean probably has dealt with that kind of phenomenon too, haven't you, Dean?
Yeah, now that I listen to you both talk and gather my thoughts, no, I've been turned down any number of times, and I'm actually fearless about asking people. And I find, and I won't name any of them for the precise reason that, first off, I'm not a mind reader, and somebody may have multiple reasons for blowing me off. Now, some of them I know it's purely their image. First off, I'm controversial. I go after some very controversial issues, and people don't want the stink of Dean to rub off on them, and I can accept that because I've chosen to get into some pretty contentious areas of politics. Some of it is literally that people hate doing press and hate doing interviews, and so and I don't know Sam Harris, but one of them might just be he's screaming at his agent, "Don't make me do this. I'll only do 5 a year. Pick the 5 that are get us the most because I hate doing it." Absolutely. And I know that's a reality. Um, and and so some may be avoiding me, some it may be a time thing, and yeah, some may be a business decision. Look, he's too small. I tried to get a guy from the Wall Street Journal once, and he said no. And I said, you know what? I don't have to. I got 5,000 readers. He's got 500,000 readers. I understand. He doesn't owe me anything. And it's even maybe something I said a year ago will come back to haunt him. Now, as I've gotten bigger, it happens less to me, right? But yeah. You do have to, in this industry, well, whatever this is it an industry? If it is, you do have to build some credibility and some trust, and some people are just never going to like you. So I find the best thing to do, because I'm like you, I like interviews, and by the way, Firing Line with William F. Buckley was a great fucking show, because what I think podcasting and to some extent blogging, depending on how you do it, are bringing back is something that used to be seen on regular television, not anymore, which is the extended interview. Buckley would do that on Fireline. Dick Cavett would do that on the Dick Cavett Show. And he spent an hour just looking at somebody and talking to them. I think maybe Bill Maher is the only one who gets close to that, and he still usually has 4 people in a little round table, which doesn't get you the intimacy and the ability to press on things that you might otherwise. Some of the best interviews going on in journalism today are happening in podcasts and on YouTubers. They're phenomenal. I've gotten college professors from around the world to sit and spend 2 hours answering my questions on my podcast and learn all kinds of shit, as did my audience, just because nobody in the regular media does that anymore.
Yeah.
So that's a positive, great thing about podcasting. But yeah, you're always going to meet people for financial or personal or even just purely psychological issues. I got a real good friend. She's popular. She does her own blog. She does her own podcast. She does her own art. She hates talking to people so badly that sometimes you can't even get her a good friend to pick up the phone because she hates that kind of interaction. And that's just who she is. So I let her all go and just keep doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And that's how I see it.
You mentioned Buckley. It's interesting because later this year or in January, I've got 2 of his biographers that I'm going to interview about Buckley. And I'm pretty much a social liberal, but I grew up watching William F. Buckley, and I disagreed with probably 90% of his views, but I admired the man. I admired his memoirs that he wrote. I think that was the best thing he ever wrote.
He asked intelligent, challenging questions.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think mass media does not do. They don't ask intelligent questions. They get stuck on this, well, I have to be against this person and I have to show that I'm against it. Well, I can interview someone. Dean and I. There are things that I'll disagree with Dean if we're talking about something. But people have
Yeah,
to.
we got to do a fight once, but what was
Yeah,
that, 10 years ago? Why hold on to it?
yeah. But the thing is, people will they don't get beyond the personal. I mean, I can disagree. Like I said, I'm an agnostic or an atheist. I have this political view. I have this view on that or the other. But I can look at someone and say, okay, they have an opposing view, or maybe a view that's only 90% different from mine. And I don't have to demonize them. But it seems that the mainstream media is unlike the podcast that I've listened to, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on blogging or podcasting. It seems that like podcastings that I've listened to, the podcast, there's less demonization of people with differing views. Would you agree, Chris, if you've listened to other podcasts, that's something that differentiates podcasting from, say, regular AM or FM radio?
Yeah, because I mean, think about it, right? Podcasts are downloaded at will, played. There's so many available. You only listen to what you want. So most people want to listen to people they agree with and people they enjoy. And so if they're constantly listening to arguments and let's try and prove this person wrong, or it's just what's the point when I can go listen to any niche I want? I want to learn about poodles. I can go listen to a podcast about poodles. Why, so I think by nature, the where blogs, and I mean, look, I'm no expert on that, but are used for reference often and easily because you just go to Google and type it in and then blogs are going to pop up. Podcasts are not used for that. They're used for, on demand, long term, or long form listening.
Conversation.
Yeah, and so it doesn't set itself up well for constant arguments.
Well, let's wrap.
And that's the sickening part. Can I just add
Yeah.
this? That's the sickening part of what so-called political discourse has become. And I know everybody started bitching about this in the 90s, but it's true, and it's only getting more intense. We have two major political parties in this country who, between them both, each of them probably represents 20% of the American populace. And they have control because of the way this election system is. And so my point is, when you're looking at red versus blue, Democrat versus Republican, left versus right, I truly believe more than half the audience is left out of those discussions, and that's why they hate them so much.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can't sit and listen to a Democrat and Republican argue on CNN anymore. I can't. I just want to start punching them both, not metaphorically, right? But still, I mean, holy shit, right? And this goes back to the authenticity, because those people are spin doctors, and we know it, even if we like them. Like, I really like James Carville. I can't fucking listen to him because I can't keep him straight, because I can't take him seriously, because I know he's on. And what the authentic, real blogger, real podcaster, even real tuber is giving you is whatever they're saying, they believe it, or they're genuinely wanting to provoke a conversation because they're not sure what they believe, but one thing or the other, they're real. And I think that's going to be, I really believe that's going to be the most important commodity on the internet in the next 10 years. I really do.
Well, let's wrap this show up in the last 10 minutes or so and just talk about some of the more positive things. I want to ask both of you if, aside from your own work, to name some of the bloggers or podcasts that you think you listen to and why you think they're good. So let me start with Dean. If you could name just two or three, either podcasts or blogs that you still follow and why.
All right. Just to be aware, heavily into gender politics, and so the ones that I like are fairly controversial. My two favorites are, where is a YouTuber in this? Are they podcasters or aren't they? I don't know. But two of my favorite podcasters or YouTubers are Karen Strawn, aka Girl Writes What, and a British gentleman who goes by the name Sargon of Akkad. They're both brilliant expositors. And obviously I agree with them a lot, which is why I like them. But they're powerful. And by powerful, I mean it's going to be hard to listen to what they have to say and just have a flip dismissal to what they have to say. Sort of like Buckley. Even if you didn't like him, you know he thought about it a long time before that came out of his mouth, and you're not going to be able to just bat it away like an ash, right? He's formed an argument. You're going to have to address it. You don't get to just flick it away if you're being honest with yourself. And that's the kind of controversial person I like, because they put real thought into it before they put pen to paper or open their fucking mouths. I like those two. Instapundit, Glenn Reynolds, yes, he's right-wing libertarian, but he's smart and he's very fast, and he's blogging old school, even though one word at a time. So I still really like and admire him. And I guess all I can get back to is, whether it's real or not, these people strike me as real. They believe what they're saying. And even if they have idiosyncrasies, you know what their idiosyncrasies are. So, yeah, there's some people I named for you.
Chris, how about you? Are there a couple of 2 or 3 podcasts that you listen to regularly, and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think the beautiful thing of podcasts is you can listen on the subject you're interested in at the moment. So I often change based on what I'm trying to figure out. So, for example, I've been getting into like looking at selling on Amazon, just a hobby. And there's a podcast called The Amazing Seller. It's great. Will I listen to it forever? No. But I think one of the beautiful parts is you can just binge and go to something else. On a consistent basis, I'd say the two that I listen to they're similar to mine, and that's why I do what I do. So it's the Tim Ferriss show and the James Altucher show. I love people just talking to cool people, and I want to learn about them. And oftentimes, unfortunately, I can't get those guests because I'm not Tim Ferriss and a best-selling author yet. So like he did an interview with Tony Robbins, who, I think one day I'll have Tony Robbins on the show, but at this point I haven't. And so I might as well do the next best thing and listen to two people I respect. So those are some that I listen to.
Tim Ferriss, is that the astronomer?
No, Tim Ferriss, he wrote the book 4-Hour Work Week.
Okay.
Which, that's a different story. That's the other thing about podcasting. I mean, regardless of if you like his books or not, the way he talks to people is very conversational, and oftentimes they're great guests. So that's all I'm listening for.
Dean had mentioned he thinks the future of blogging is bright, and he gave his reasons for authenticity. How about the future of podcasting, Chris? What do you see in the next 5 or 10 years, possibly?
Yeah, so I think for the general population as a consumer, the future of podcasting is fantastic. It's every 2015 car, I believe it was, has this. I don't even know what it is. John was telling my co-host was telling me, but you can listen to podcasts on it basically. So people will continue to listen to more. There's some great, well-produced podcasts. Obviously, most people have heard of Serial. You have Startup Podcast. However, for the producer, I think we're already starting to see kind of what I think, and again, I've never been a blogger, so I don't know, but kind of happened to blogs is like people are now coming in, they're bringing their own, their own platform, their own following, and they're instantly becoming big. And for the mom and pop, it's much harder. So Smart People Podcast has a leg up because we've been there for 5 years. But I've helped friends and businesses create podcasts over the years, and to now gain a following is really difficult. And I think it's a shame because, for example, if you type in best podcasts around, the vast majority of things you're going to find all tell you to listen to the same podcast, right? Mark Maron and I don't know how stuff works. I don't This American Life, and they're great, but there's no way to find more of them, really. There's not a good way. It tends to just be whoever has the most influence has the biggest podcast, and I think that's a little bit of a shame. So for people listening, yeah, you're going to get better produced content. For people trying to put their voice out there, of course, as it grows, it's going to become more difficult.
Chris, you had mentioned that you still have to work a day job.
Oh, yeah.
What tell me about, say, just your own personal current pursuits and what you personally where you hope to be in the next few years yourself, aside from the rest of the medium.
Yeah. So right now, I mean, aside from that, I'm the kind of guy, I have 5 jobs at any given time. I love the environment we're in right now. So I help people create podcasts. I coach people, career coach. I speak, but I'm trying to narrow that down. So right now, I work for Franklin Covey, and I do productivity training basically, and it's kind of a perfect segue into where I want to get in my career, which is I don't necessarily want to say thought leader because that I think is kind of I don't want to say egotistical, but you just want people to listen to you. I do feel that given 5 years of the podcast, the training and the speaking I'm doing for Franklin Covey, plus some own life experiences, I can now help people navigate some of their life a lot easier or a lot better, or just open them up. And so I'm really hoping to get into kind of the content creation space and speaking. And so and integrating what I've learned through the podcast into that. And I'm excited about that.
Dean, I know back when you were blogging, you were, I guess, a computer program or something like that. What's your day job now? I know you work for A Voice for Men. Is that your day job right now, editing that? Dean?
My apologies. I am no longer with A Voice for Men, but don't worry that it is not it was not an acrimonious parting. It was just time for me to move on. And right now I've been spending because I quit a couple months ago, and I've been basically relaxing and just trying to decide what my next goal is going to be. Although I still write the occasional article, I probably will have a new website, blog, and podcast soon, but I'm talking to various people about it, so I can't give you anything concrete just yet. Probably by early first quarter next year, though, Dean Esme is going to be writing on some horse again.
Okay.
So, yeah, and there's always opportunities in this new media landscape. In fact, it's still changing as we speak. It's interesting to watch it.
Okay, well, let's wrap the show. I'll give you both a couple of minutes to closing remarks. Dean, if you just want to take a minute or two to give your thoughts on what we've been talking about and just sum up your opinion.
I think I'll sum up my opinion is I do not believe blogging is dead any more than I believe radio was killed by television. No, blogging had more competition, just like radio had more competition. And if you think about it that way, podcasting is radio. It's just come back and it's being transmitted a new way. And I think all this is fine. I think the final analysis is that you have to decide what is your area, what is going to distinguish you from the rest of the pack if you're going to do this. Is it because you take controversial stands, or is it because you take a certain type of intellectual stand, or not? And even if you're going to engage in fighting, which some people do, just remember that can be productive. Fighting with people can be productive. It really can. No, anybody sits there and says, "No, fight, don't argue." That's never. No, sometimes it is. I have really learned from people who ground in my face hard that I was wrong. And that's something everybody should experience at least once. Just really publicly, like having to eat crow because you were just flat fucking wrong. Not that you were mean, you were just wrong. And if you can do that, people will respond to that. Either that no bullshit. This is what I think, or this is what I believe is true based on this evidence. And here's the evidence. Look at it yourself. People will respond to that, and that is probably why. I truly believe people are going to go more and more toward podcasts and more toward YouTubers and more toward blogs, because what they'll look for is people they can trust, because institutions are losing trust everywhere you look. And that's what I think.
Chris, how about you? If you could just sum up your opinions on what we've been talking about in a minute or two.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of would say that first, one of the things I tell everybody, and I mentioned it earlier, is build something. Just build anything. The things I've gotten out of a podcast are far more beneficial than, or it's much more than any money, right? It's connection, it's almost identity, it's knowledge, and I've gotten jobs out of it. I'm more interesting to people. So just don't even worry about what happens with it. We didn't even tell a single friend we were starting the podcast. We didn't tell a single person we were doing the podcast because we didn't really care. We were doing it for ourselves. iTunes picked it up, ran with it, people liked it, end of the story for the most part. so don't concern yourself so much with that if you can do it along with your day job. And the other thing I'll say is, and this is tough because sometimes it might sound elitist or whatever, but you know, I find that along the lines of authenticity, a lot of people are appealing to the least common denominator. They're kind of putting out, I don't know, junk, right? It's like the equivalent of reality TV. Why are those some of the most popular TV shows? And it's sadly because that many people love them. So, you know, I challenge people to not try to do it for the wrong reasons. You know, think about your legacy, why you're doing what you're doing. I know Dean mentioned it earlier, and for somebody who blogs and whatnot, I really respect that. I mean, I interviewed Tucker Max, and we won't get into that, but he hung up on me 18 minutes into the interview, first time it's ever happened, because I questioned him. You know, he said, "Look, I'm a New York Times bestseller. I'm adding value. People are buying my book." But drug dealers, people buy their drugs. They're not adding value. So, you know, think about why you're doing it. Try and create something, and learn as you go.
Yeah, the lowest common denominator has always been my bane in the arts, and it just brought to mind about 5 or 6 years ago when the Huffington Post, I think, first became corporate, or first had a, what is it, when not a buyout,
An IPO?
Yeah, an IPO, yeah. I sent a proposal for them to do a book section, and I outlined it in 1 or 2 pages, and I didn't hear back from them for about 5 or 6 months. Then they started a book section that took all of my ideas, but instead of focusing on quality writing, instead of focusing on good writing from the past, which was available then through the then still fairly new Project Gutenberg, and educating people, they took every idea and bastardized it to push the lowest common denominator, Sex in the City kind of stuff, and even the stuff that made make Sex in the City look like something written by Dostoevsky. So I know
Yeah,
exactly what you mean about the lowest common denominator.
absolutely.
So I want to thank both Chris and Dean. It was a good show. And next week, speaking of moving outside your own comfort zones or anything, I'll be having a show with a fellow who's a professor of religion and also someone who's a mental health activist on how to best live your life. So that should be interesting too. So again, Chris and Dean, thanks for your time.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Find me on Twitter at Dean Esme.